Hi, I'm Jen Barnes, and you're about to experience how to ditch the old ways of doing things, embrace your neurodivergence, learn tips and tricks to function optimally, and love yourself, neurodivergence and all. Welcome to the Self-Loved Woman podcast. Hey, it's Jen. I'm so glad you're here. Today, I want to unpack something that is really common that we as ADHD women do, and especially as entrepreneurs, because we often have so many things on our plate. But that maybe isn't always the most effective, right? So you might be thinking, what is it, Jen? There's lots of things I do that are ineffective. I mean, I don't know. Maybe you're thinking that. It's having out of sight, out of mind piles. It's like that inner organizational system of having a pile. And it's like, well, I know where everything is. And that's true. Like, we absolutely know where everything is in the pile. I mean, some of us do. I mean, sometimes we do or don't. I don't know. But we have an idea. We have our own way of organizing things. And I'm not in any way poo-pooing the idea of organizing things in a way that works for you. But I want to raise the question of, does it always work for you? Because what I notice is I do these out of sight, out of mind piles every once in a while. And if you follow my Instagram or TikTok accounts or Facebook account, you saw reels or a reel of photos of my different piles that have happened this week that have been building up for the past month or two. And it's all these things that I want to do and books I want to read and a reminder to use my alpha stim, which is like a thing that helps calm the nervous system, essentially. It's like I've got a pile over here for paychecks from insurance companies that I need to input that I received them, and a pile over here for something else, and so many journals everywhere that each have a very specific purpose and are put on a table so I remember to look at all of them. Is anyone else? This is me. And books. I have so many books in sight because I have so many books I want to read because I buy all the books. Does anyone else buy all the books? I eventually do read them. Although I've recently learned a new skill in my 49th year on the planet last year, which is that you don't have to read a full book. You can read part of it and get the gist and be like, that's good enough. Or you can start a book and be like, yeah, I don't like this, and stop. And I was able to do that last year with fiction. I was starting to do it a little bit in 2018 with nonfiction. I was like, I don't align with what this person's saying at all. I don't have to force myself to read this. To the point where now I'm like, all right, I got the point, and no longer shame myself about it. Because I used to do that. I'd read like books 3/4 of the way through and I was like, oh, I wasn't able to finish, which just adds to our pile of ADHD women, like how you don't finish things that you start, right? I don't know if anyone's had that narrative. Well, what if the reason we don't finish things we start, like a book, for example, I know I'm on a tangent, by the way, but what if we don't finish things we start, like a book, is because it no longer makes sense to do it? Or midway through, we realize that actually doesn't align with where we're, with our values or where we're taking things, the direction we're going. And sometimes it's because we get bored. Like, that's fair. So we can work on manufacturing interest if it is something that we actually need to do. And that does align with our vision and our mission and our values. But sometimes if we don't feel like finishing something like a book, it may be because it's not serving a purpose for us anymore. Same with journals. I have the same problem. I have a lot of started journals that I never finished. Anyway, I'm off track. I'm going to come back on. So getting back to these things around us that we keep in our environment so that we remember to use them. So for me, it's journals and books and file folders of billing things to attend to for my private practice. You might have other things. But either way, we try to help ourselves remember to do stuff by having these piles. And the problem is it's just not super effective. And like I said, I get it. You might be like, Jen, I know everything that's in that pile. And for sure, that's true. But what I'll say that I notice in myself is that those piles eventually become clutter and they actually start to create a sense of overwhelm in my body. And a sense of I don't even know where to start. I got all this stuff. I don't even know where to start. And so I was reflecting on this pattern because I don't always do this. There's some times where I'm not. And I'm like, what's the difference between the times when I am doing the out of sight, out of mind piles versus when I'm not? Because I'm still attending to those things another way. And I realize that there's one specific difference that we'll talk about later. But before we get there, in case you're feeling called out, I just want to name that, like, we come by this honestly. Our brains need to see things or we will forget them. You might be the kind of person, if you're like me, who it's like, if you haven't talked to a friend in a while, you almost like forget that they exist. And don't get me wrong, I love my friends. They're amazing. But to remember to stay in contact with them, iPhones have this awesome like thing you can pin. I don't know, it's either 6, I think it's 9 contacts. And so I've pinned all my closest people so that I see it every time I open my text messages. I'm like, oh, I haven't talked to so-and-so in a while. I need to text them and see how they're going. Because before, I actually would like schedule reminders in my task list to connect with friends. Because out of sight, out of mind. Not because I don't care about them and love them and want them in my life, but it's just not how my ADHD brain works. And I hear I'm not alone. So we come by this super honestly, whether it's with people or things we have to do, because we're just like trying to get stuff done day to day and then focus on whatever's in front of us. So to try and then also like juggle all the balls that we've created for ourselves, which like sometimes we end up adding too many things to our plate, which I talked about in a recent social media post too, is like, we have a hard time saying no. And so that's part of, we end up with all of these extra tasks and we have a hard time saying no for a few reasons. Oh, I sent it in an email. That's what it was. Is that like, we have a hard time saying no, one, because like, we don't want to be in trouble or criticized, because remember, the estimate is that by age 10, ADHDers receive 20,000 more critical or negative comments as kids. So like, of course, we've found ways to avoid getting in trouble or being criticized. And one of those is taking on things. Another big thing that I see that gets us into these stacks of to-dos and books to read and all that is we struggle with time blindness. So we don't have any idea how long something's going to take. So we're like, sure, I can do that. And then we're like, oh, wait a minute. I committed to this thing that in my ADHD brain, I thought, yeah, that'll take like 15 minutes, maybe 30 at most. And like 8 hours later, we're like, oh shit, I'm knee deep. Right? And so like, there's so many reasons why we end up overcommitting and put so much on our plate in the first place and then end up having all these piles. So like, if you're feeling called out in any way or this is resonating, just know like you come by this super honestly. This is part of ADHD and it's something we can learn to navigate, but we need to do it intentionally. So I want to talk a little bit about why this is even a problem. I spoke a little bit about what I noticed in myself is that these piles tend to dysregulate my nervous system and create overwhelm. That's what clutter does, and it creates distraction. And so I want to think about, I want to pull back and think about the nervous system for a moment. For me, when I see all that stuff to do, and I'm also aware of the limited time I have, I feel stress in my body. And when we feel stress, oftentimes that means we're popping into our, in fact, I just noticed it in my chest right now. It was like, right? I could feel my fight or flight response turn on right now as I even talk about that. And I raised my 2 hands to represent both. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's so real. That stress is putting us into our fight or flight response. And then we end up being dysregulated emotionally. And unless we're doing things to actively calm our nervous system when we notice that, or we are doing things to release the stress from our body every day, that stress builds up over time and then makes it even harder to focus. Because one of the things that makes it hard for us to do things and get ourselves to focus when we're doing them is a dysregulated nervous system. So even though these piles feel like they're helping us, they're actually not doing us any favors. I find that I can do like a little pile, like, because I tend to read like 3 books at the same time, which that doesn't stress me out. It's just like, I don't know, it's just how my brain does it. So I can have the 3 books I'm reading, but if I have the 3 books plus the book I want to read after, like, which is what I have now and what was in the pictures that I shared on social media, then it starts to get overwhelming. And so really understanding where your threshold is, and some of that'll be being connected to your body experiences and being able to notice like, oh yeah, I'm feeling stressed. And it's like, how might you notice that? Well, some of it might be just paying attention. Like when you're stressed, what do you notice? Are you biting your nails? Are you chewing your cheek? Is your mind racing faster than usual? That's a common one. Do you feel anxious? Do you feel like you need to move more? Just whatever kind of things are going on with your nervous system, it's important to pay attention to. Some people feel it in their chest, like I was saying earlier. You might feel it in your belly. But paying attention like, ooh, I flipped into my fight or flight response, which I want to remind you, your fight or flight response isn't bad. It's useful. It helps you in the face of a threat. It's just that we don't want all of our tasks to be threats. Because think about that. Your nervous system doesn't know the difference between a tiger chasing you and a stack of books you want to read or things you need to do. And so if your nervous system gets into its fight or flight response over this pile of things, it doesn't know that it's not life-threatening. And so as you can imagine, when you're being chased by a tiger, it's really not that important to be able to focus on reading a book or doing a task, because you just need to get away from the tiger. That's what your entire body is working together to do. So when you are faced with this big pile that triggers your fight or flight response, your body's just trying to get away and get out of it, which is not going to help with procrastination. It's not going to be like, oh yeah, I feel really stressed about this. I should just dig into it, right? Like, oh, I feel stressed about this tiger chasing me. I should just, really lean into that experience. It's like, no, our urge is to get away or fight. And yeah, fighting can be productive sometimes, but generally speaking, if the task that you have is, things that run your business or you're working on your business, those tasks are best done from a regulated state. Like it's really hard to write content or do your podcast or create a website or do some of the more focusy tasks. Like if the tech stuff is hard for you, or bookkeeping or whatever it is, it's hard to do that when you can't concentrate, when your nervous system is dysregulated. So those piles, while they seem like a good idea, oftentimes they end up making it harder for you to get to work and harder for you to focus, because of the overwhelm they create and the way it impacts your nervous system. So I get that it's like, oh my gosh, but Jen, I if it's out of sight, what will I do? And that's what we're going to talk a little bit more about today. So before we even go there, before we even talk about what to do, the first piece of what to do, like step 0, is to hold yourself with grace and compassion. Because you come by these problems honestly. Figuring out ways to do things and not forget about things is part of being ADHD, especially in this neurotypical world that requires us to be productive to some degree, to support ourselves. So to hold yourself with grace and compassion around it is the very first important step, because if you're shaming yourself, that's not exactly going to make you feel motivated, at least not for very long. And it's going to make your business not fun. And eventually you're going to stop working on your business, right? The other thing I will say, kind of step 0.1, my math degree brain is having a hissy fit in my inside. It's like, that's not how numbering systems work, Jen, but that's fine. But if we did a step 0.1, my social worker ADHD self is loving it, by the way. But anyway, if we were to do step 0.1, I want to emphasize the importance of whatever you create, whatever system you end up creating as we talk about this. It's essential that it's flexible and adaptable. I have heard from so many ADHD women that rigid structure feels like a jail cell. And hey, I'm someone who likes structure. It's possibly because I might be ADHD, but I like structure. It's also possible that I learned that structure was what kept this train on the rails. So I'm like, I know I need structure and I adhere to it very strongly, probably, because it's like, if I don't, my whole life would fall apart. So, who knows which that is. But either way, I know that for some ADHDers, structure is like a 4-letter word, right? So it's important that whatever you create for yourself is adaptable and flexible and maybe even fun. I've got the image of Danny Donovan's book, The Anti-Planner, which is like so fun and has all these games and creative ways of doing things, right? And that's what makes it easy for our ADHD brain to do stuff, is we make it novel and interesting and fun and playful, and then we can do it with greater ease. So whatever you decide to do for yourself here on out, it can be really helpful if you can do it with a mind of flexibility and adaptability and playfulness. And when I say flexibility and adaptability, I also mean tweaking things as you go, or starting a new system. I used to have so much shame around starting planners and then not being able to finish planners. The one planner I was able to use pretty consistently was back in the 90s, the Franklin planner, but I was an actuary and that was needed because I had so many tiny little tasks and detail that I had to track. But now that just doesn't work for me. I've gone through many different systems and sometimes I circle back to some that were working for a while and then I get bored of, and I'm like, all right, I'm going to try a different one for a while. And then I try that for a while and I'm like, okay, I'm bored of that. Let's try another one. So rather than shaming myself, I'm like, oh, this is just how my brain is. So whatever you decide to create for yourself inside of this, know that this is just what's going to work for now. It doesn't have to work for the rest of your life. When I think about that, I plan on living till 100 or so, and I'm 50. So for me to find a strategy that works for the rest of my life, that's 50 years. That's as long as I've lived. That's insane to even consider, right? It's if I can find a strategy that would work for the next 3 to 6 months, and if it was a year, fantastic. It's okay. But I think a lot of times we think we've got to figure something out that will work forever. And it's just not how most of our brains work. So, okay, those are step 0 and 0.1. The big thing that I want to tell you is that when our piles get bigger and bigger and bigger, at least what I notice in myself and what I suspect is probably true for you, or at least most of you listening, is that it means we are not planning. It means that we are not being intentional and we are more flying by the seat of our pants. It means that we are succumbing to shiny object syndrome, which for me is shiny book syndrome, or fear of missing out syndrome around books. That's a big thing, or fear of missing out in general. But to me, when my out of sight, out of mind piles get big, it's because I'm just saying yes to a bunch of stuff for different reasons and putting too much on my plate that doesn't even make sense. And I'm not being intentional. And so it's okay, then how do we do that? Well, a lot of this is deeper work. It's certainly work we do in my program Ascend, but we work on getting clear on your values. You want to get clear on your values and then get really clear on your vision for your life. What do you want out of this life? What do you want for your business? And this doesn't have to be 5 years. This could be what do you want out of your business in the next, 90 days? And getting clear on that. You might look forward till the end of the year. I mean, it's a good idea to have a general idea. You don't have to write it in stone, but to think about that. What do I want? And for me, what books do I really want to get through in the next 90 days? And that even felt too much. For me, it's okay, what are the 3 books I want to read right now? And then the others can go somewhere else. And maybe I can write them on a list, my books for 2024, but then not look at the list, but remember that I have it, which might be part of the problem, is remembering we have it. So you want to create a system for helping yourself remember that works for you. And if you're like, Jen, what system? This is not going to be good news probably, because I can't tell you, because it has to be something that comes from inside you that you know you'll use. Like, I can tell you what I do. She'd be like, that's weird. I would never do that. Like, I'm someone who, when I am laying in bed and think of something and don't want to get out of bed to write it down, if I throw a sock on the floor, or if I take something off my nightstand and throw it on the floor, when I get up in the morning, I'll be like, oh, that's not supposed to be there. What's that about? And because I've linked it in my brain to the thing I wanted to write down but forgot, I will remember. Like, that's just weird. I don't know if anyone else does that, but like, we all have our own systems for how our unique brain works. And so you might find a way to track things that are different than how my brain works. But what I can tell you is chances are, if your piles are getting out of control, it's because your plate is overloaded, and that's because you're not clear on your priorities. And you may be accepting tasks that are not aligned with your values, or for sure not aligned with your priorities, especially inside of your business. And so what I would do, if this is me, and this is what I did do, is sit down and go, what do I want to do in my business and for my business over the next 90 days? What do I want to do over the next 6 months? And let's sort that out. Let's sit down and sort that out. And then we'll figure out what really needs to happen. What are these things on my to-do list, which has gotten way too long, and these things in these piles that are ridiculously large? What of those things can be skipped? What of those things can be deleted? And then figuring out, like, what of these things can be automated? Like, right now, I'm working on my accounting for my private practice, which is an S Corp. And, I started out as an accounting major. I had all the accounting classes in high school you could have. I was an actuary for almost 4 years, working in financial analysis and pricing, worked very closely with the accountants and figuring out our earnings and all that, and why we made money statistically, all that. And for the love of me, I have the worst time now. Of course, it's like, almost 30 years later, 25 years later, whatever. But like, I have the worst time figuring this out. This takes way too much brain space for me. I make a lot of mistakes with it because it's not something I do regularly. And so to me, this is a task that needs to be delegated. And I tried to delegate it last year, but it didn't work out. My contact didn't come through. So this is something that's clear to me. I have spent way too many hours this week on that, which means I'm not getting to my other piles. So when you have so much on your plate, one, you want to get clear on what you actually need to do and what can be deleted. And two, you want to figure out, like, what can be delegated, what can be automated. Because it's like, there's probably stuff on your plate and stuff in that pile that either doesn't need to be done or can be delegated or automated. And if you're a mom and you're like, I'm the only one who can, all right, here's the thing. I say this with the most love in my heart, and I mean it. I really do, because I chose not to have kids, and I watch the women in my life who I love dearly and everything that's on their plate, and clients, loved ones, everyone. Not that I don't love my clients, but it's a different kind of relationship. But anyway, and I get that it's a lot of work. And I also get that there is a way to teach your children to participate more in the household. As a side note, and I'm not saying this like I told you so, but like, I hear so much. They're like, I can't do that. I have to do this for my kid. I don't want to be a bad mom, right? I don't want them to think I don't care about them or value them. And I get it. But we can show our kids that we value and care about them in ways other than doing everything for them. And I just need to say that because I know a lot of you moms, you entrepreneurs out there are moms. And one of the things that it's just like, you feel like you do so much for your kids. And, I'll never forget the time there is a loved one in my life when I was at their house watching their 2 kids. And I was like, hey, okay, ladies, we're done with dinner. I need you to, before you go play, because they got up from the table, I need you to bring your plates to the sink. And they both looked at me and, our mom doesn't make us do that. And I was like, no, I know, but I'm not her. And my intention is for you to grow up and be a sufficient adult, like self-sufficient adult, where you can do stuff for yourself. And I trust that you have the ability at this age to do this for yourself. And so I don't want to take away that learning from you because I know you can do it. And they were like, oh, okay. And they just did it. And when that person in my life came home, they're like, what? Right? Like, and it didn't occur to them that they were doing this for them when they could do it for themselves. And I will tell you, I used to work with kids 0 to 5. It's like 18 months old, at 18 months old, these kids, and now granted it was, at Fort Carson, so it was an Army installation, but these kids at 18 months old could carry their tray of food, and they could put their silverware in the silverware bin, like that had soapy water. Before that, they would dump the food they weren't going to eat in another thing, put the silverware in, and then put the tray on the stack. They were like 18 months and they could do that. And I'm not saying every 18-month-old, sure, there's developmental differences and whatever. But like, I think a lot of times we underestimate what kids can do and then we put more on our load. And while I'm talking about kids, this is very similar in our business. A lot of times, if we have a team, we underestimate what they can do and don't give them a chance. And I know I'm guilty of that. I know I'm like, ew. But the thing is sometimes we have to detach and just be like, you know what? Sometimes shit just has to get done. And sometimes it's good enough. And I can always speak about like how I'd like things to be tweaked later. So whether we're delegating to our kids, delegating to a spouse, I got to tell you, if your spouse is a man, that's a whole different conversation that I probably don't want to unpack because I've got some personal anger and frustration about what I've witnessed in that. But what I'll say is, your spouse should theoretically be also doing things around the house so that you can work in your business and work on your business. But there are ways to delegate everything in your life so that you have more time for the things that you actually need to do, because that's the last piece is what of these tasks, what of that pile actually needs to be done now and needs to be done by you. And as you sort through that pile will get smaller. And it might be that as you're starting your business, if you still have a job and you're starting your business and you're not feeling ready to hire out yet, it may be that for now, there are a lot of things you need to do. There is a time where I was like, I have to do my bookkeeping. I can't afford to pay someone else right now. And yes, I understand putting that out there. I can't afford is not useful. So cancel. But I legitimately did not have the money in my account or on a credit card to pay someone to do my bookkeeping for the amount it was going to cost. It just wasn't there. That was the reality. And that wasn't something I felt comfortable giving to a VA that was outside of the country. It just did not feel like a good decision for me. So that's one that I continue to do for myself that I will be giving up this year. So there might be things that you choose to do for yourself, but I will also tell you there are ways to delegate some of the tasks like social media posting or people edit my podcast. There are ways to delegate that and to virtual assistants who live in another country and you pay them multiple times their minimum wage because their cost of living is different there than where you likely are, especially if you're in the States. So it is less expensive option for you. And yes, I support American workers. I do. I think it's important to support American workers. And at the same time, these people out of the country need support too. And when you're growing your business, you might not be able to afford a social media manager that makes $150 an hour in the States, but you can afford to pay someone $10 an hour in the Philippines or $8 an hour, whatever, right? So it's important to recognize that there are ways to delegate that maybe aren't as cost prohibitive as you think, right? Okay. So we talked about the piles and we talked about how to get through them. And I will say that another piece of this is emotional, and that's the deeper work. Because sometimes we get attached to like doing everything. We have taken on messages that if we don't do it, it won't be done right, or that we can't rely on anybody else, or any host of things that you learned in your growing up experience. And that requires some deeper work with the parts of you who hold on to that. It's like, okay, so there's a part of me that is afraid to delegate this thing. And what's that about? What am I concerned would happen if I delegated this? And to unpack that and work with it and work with the feelings and see if you can get to the bottom of it and maybe see if you can come to a compromise of like, okay, well, let's try it out and see how it goes, right? Sometimes it's that you don't trust yourself that you could handle it if you delegate something and it doesn't go the way you want. And then you'd have to have a conversation like, hey, this is really close. I like what you did here, but what would be even better is if you could do this. Some of us maybe don't feel like we have those skills or trust ourselves to be able to do it. And I get it. Those conversations can be uncomfortable. But I think it's important that we remember there's a difference between unsafe and uncomfortable. And I got to tell you, deciding to build a business is definitely going to be uncomfortable. And I'm not trying to like make that a self-fulfilling prophecy, but I will tell you, there are two things in this world so far that I've learned are incredible growth experiences, like inner growth experiences for yourself that aren't necessarily meant to be growth experiences. Like going to therapy. I started going to therapy in my 20s, and that was intentionally to grow in some way, right? Well, it was to feel better. And then I learned it was to grow. But like, there are two things that I believe we do, not necessarily being like, I'm going to do this so I can grow as an individual human, but that are probably some of the biggest growth opportunities we'll have. One is raising kids. And I think anyone who's a parent listening to this, you're like, oh gosh, yes, absolutely. Because as a parent, your kids mirror back your own behavior and words, right? It's like, oh crap. Like it's like a mirror of like, okay, here's the shit I need to work on inside of myself. Or wow, I get triggered when my teenage daughter says this. What's that about? Raising kids is a constant growth opportunity. But you know what else is? Building a business that you own. Starting and building your very own business. Because you will constantly be faced with challenges, not because like, it has to be hard, but just because things come up and you can see them as challenges, or you can see them as, all right, this is just what it is to own a business and I'm going to learn something in this. That's probably a better mindset to shift towards. But to think that you're just going to start a business and like, everything's going to be like, whatever, and I'm just going to get to be positive and happy right away all the time, I just think is a misconception. Sure, your attitude is going to, about what comes up in your business is definitely going to make a difference. But if you think starting a business is only going to be positive, I think there's a rude awakening coming your way, or you might shame yourself when it's anything other than positive. Because probably one of the biggest growth opportunities we can have if we decide not to have kids is starting our own business and building it. Because we are constantly having to face ourselves in so many ways. And if you've started a business already, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So I'd encourage you to do some of this inner work that comes up as you're trying to work on your business, as you're working through those out of sight, out of mind piles. And a piece of it is going to be sorting through like how do I prioritize my tasks? How do I say no? What makes it hard to say no? How do I delegate? How do I automate? How do I let go? All right, y'all. It's been great connecting with you today. I hope this was helpful. I'd love if you comment and let me know what resonated with you. But even more, I'd love it if you'd follow and share. All right, take care.